The cold in northern Minnesota isn't just a weather pattern. It is a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of frost that settles deep into the marrow of your bones. By November 12, 1976, the town of Ely had already been swallowed by an early, unforgiving winter. The air didn't just bite, it chewed. It carried the suffocating scent of wet iron ore, frozen pine needles, and the dying breath of an industry that was slowly strangling the men who served it. At 4:14 a.m., the world was a graveyard of rusted machinery and silent, salt-crusted homes. But the silence at the entrance of the Iron Vein claim was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping town. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind of silence that follows a scream. Sheriff Elias Miller's 1975 Ford Custom 500 crunched over the frozen slush of Highway 169, the tires screaming against the black ice. The blue and red emergency lights didn't pierce the thick rolling fog. They bled into it, creating a sickening, rhythmic violet haze that pulsed against the snowbanks. Miller was a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of a granite quarry with a dull chisel, lined, weathered, and cold. He gripped the thin steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned the translucent white of the ice outside. He had lived in the Iron Range his entire life, and he knew that when the radio barked at 4 a.m. about shots fired near the old Kachmeric claim, it didn't mean a hunter had missed a deer. It meant the powder keg had finally blown. As the Ford slid to a halt near the rusted chain-link perimeter, the high-beam headlights illuminated a scene that would remain etched into the town's collective memory for the next 50 years. A 55-gallon drum of diesel had been perforated by high-velocity rounds, leaking a black, iridescent slick that mixed with the melting slush to create a rainbow of filth. In the center of that oily mess lay a single discarded welder's mask, its protective glass shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. There was no wind, yet the heavy iron chains on the main gate swayed with a ghostly momentum, clinking against the steel posts like a slow-motion funeral bell. Miller stepped out of the cruiser, the door creaking on ungreased hinges. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. The smell hit him instantly, a violent, jarring assault on the senses. It wasn't just the acrid, burnt toast smell of spent 12-gauge shells or the sulfuric tang of cordite hanging in the damp air. It was the heavy, metallic, copper-sweet scent of fresh blood cooling on frozen dirt. It was a smell that didn't belong in the clean, pine-scented wilderness of the North Woods. It was the smell of the slaughterhouse brought to the sacred ground of the hills. He didn't draw his sidearm yet. His hands felt sluggish, heavy with the dread of what lay beyond the light of his car. He stood there for a moment, his breath hitching in his chest, forming thick, ragged white blooms that vanished into the darkness like ghosts. 10 feet away, the first body became visible in the periphery of his headlights. It was face down, a heavy canvas Carhartt coat soaked through with a darkness that wasn't oil. The man's hand was outstretched, fingers curled into the frozen mud as if he were trying to pull himself back into the earth he had spent his life digging. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a drunken brawl at a local tavern over a card game or a woman. This was the catastrophic conclusion of a century-old blood feud, a final, violent punctuation mark at the end of a long, miserable sentence written in greed, pride, and desperation. The Iron Vein had finally claimed its due, not in the rich red ore that built the skyscrapers of Chicago and New York, but in the very man who broke their backs to reach it. Miller reached for his heavy, chrome-plated flashlight, clicking it on with a mechanical snap. The beam was a solid blade of light, cutting through the fog and revealing the true scale of the carnage. Spent brass casings littered the ground like spilled grain, glittering under the artificial light. He followed the trail of brass and blood toward the yawning, pitch-black mouth of the mine shaft, a hole in the side of the mountain that looked like a throat ready to swallow the world. He thought about the Kachmeric brothers. He thought about the men they had hired to stand guard. He thought about the legal papers, the disputed boundaries, and the threats whispered over glasses of cheap whiskey in the dimly lit corners of the rusty shovel bar. Everyone in Ely knew this was coming. The lawyers had failed, the mediators had failed, even the church had failed to quell the simmering rage between those who owned the land and those who bled for it. As Miller's boots crunched over the gravel, he noticed the small details that make a tragedy human. A dropped thermos, still venting a tiny wisp of steam, a pack of crumpled Lucky Strikes, a photograph, half submerged in a frozen bottle, showing a smiling woman in a summer dress, a stark contrast to the gray, violent reality of this November night.
He felt the weight of his badge pressing against his chest, feeling more like a target than a shield. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of his cooling car engine and the distant, lonely howl of a timber wolf miles away in the Boundary Waters. The law had arrived, but the law was too late. The Iron Range had its own set of rules, written in the dark, deep underground, where the sun never shines and the conscience goes numb. Miller took a deep breath of the freezing air, feeling it sear his lungs. He adjusted his belt, clicked his radio, and prepared to call in the body count. But as he looked toward the mine entrance, he saw a flicker of movement, a shadow within the shadow. The massacre wasn't just a moment in time, it was a living, breathing entity that was still stalking the tunnels of the Iron Vein. The night was far from over, and the frozen ground of Minnesota was hungry for more than just the 12 men already lying still in the snow. "Dispatch," Miller whispered into the cold plastic of his mic, his voice cracking like thin ice. "This is Miller. Get the coroner. Get the state police. Get everyone. There's a lot of them. God help us, they're all over the ridge." He stood there, a solitary figure in a vast, dark landscape, surrounded by the ghosts of a conflict that had finally consumed itself. The iron was deep, the winter was long, and the memories were about to become fatal. This was the beginning of the end for Ely, a town that would never again be known for its beauty, but only for the blood that stained its ore.
The sun didn't rise over the Iron Range on the morning of November 4th. It merely turned the sky a bruised, sickly shade of pewter. In the town of Ely, the morning ritual was a symphony of industrial decay. It began with the rhythmic coughing of cold diesel engines and the scraping of iron shovels against frozen driveways. This was a place where men measured their lives in tons of extracted earth and their worth in the calluses on their palms. But by 1976, the pride of the North was beginning to rust. The glory days of the post-war boom were a fading echo, leaving behind a generation of men who felt the world was moving on without them, leaving them to rot in the shadows of their own derricks. Inside the kitchen of the Gable household, a small, drafty wooden structure that leaned slightly to the west, the air smelled of burnt fat and stale tobacco. Artie Gable sat at a formica table that had been chipped by a decade of heavy use. He was 45, but in the dim, flickering light of a single overhead bulb, he looked 60. His hands, permanently stained with the fine reddish-brown dust of hematite, trembled slightly as he poured black coffee into a stained porcelain mug. Artie wasn't thinking about the ore anymore. He was thinking about the fence line on the eastern ridge of his property, the line that the Duluth mining syndicate claimed didn't exist. "Eat your eggs, Artie," his wife, Martha, whispered without turning from the stove. Her voice was like dry parchment, worn thin by years of worrying about the mortgage and the coughing fits that kept Artie awake at night. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She knew that look in his eyes, the same look his father had before the strike of '52. It was the look of a man who was being cornered, and a cornered man in Minnesota was a dangerous animal. The conflict wasn't just about dirt. It was about the vein number 9, a narrow, rich deposit of iron that ran directly beneath the Gable family's ancestral woodlot. For 3 generations, the Gables had hunted those woods and pulled timber from those slopes. But the syndicate had found a loophole in a 1912 land grant, a piece of paper signed by a man long dead, claiming that the mineral rights belonged to the corporation, not the farmer. To the men in the high-rise offices in Minneapolis, it was a legal technicality. To Artie Gable, it was a declaration of war. It was an insult to his bloodline. The sound of a heavy vehicle approaching the house broke the morning silence. Artie didn't have to look out the window to know it was the syndicate's landman, a smooth-talking shark named Henderson, who drove a brand-new lime-green Mercury Marquis. The car was an eyesore against the gray landscape, a rolling symbol of the wealth that was being sucked out of the ground while the locals struggled to buy heating oil. The tires crunched over the gravel, stopping just outside the porch. Artie stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. He reached for his heavy wool Mackinaw jacket hanging on a peg by the door. In the pocket, the cold weight of a brass knuckle duster felt familiar and grounding. He didn't plan on using it, not yet, but the weight was a comfort. It was the only power he had left. Martha finally turned, her eyes wide and pleading, but she said nothing. In this part of the country, there were things a man had to do, and a woman's silence was often her only shield. Outside, the air was so cold it felt like inhaling needles. Henderson was already out of the car, looking absurd in a camel hair coat
and polished leather shoes that were never meant for the mud of a mining town. He held a leather briefcase like a weapon. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. They remained flat and predatory, like those of a shark circling a wounded whale. "Arthur," Henderson began, his breath forming a neat, controlled puff of white. "I hope you've had time to review the final offer. The board is getting impatient. We have the drilling rig scheduled for the 14th. We'd much rather do this as neighbors than as litigants." Artie stepped off the porch, his heavy boots sinking into the half-frozen slush. He stood a head taller than Henderson, a towering monument of blue-collar defiance. He didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the mercury, at the polished chrome that reflected the desolate street and the shuttered windows of the neighbors' houses. The town was watching. Behind every lace curtain and cracked window pane, the people of Ely were waiting to see if Artie Gable would bend. Because if Artie bent, they all would. "The 14th, you say?" Artie finally spoke, his voice deep and gravelly, sounding like stones grinding together in a crusher. "That's a Sunday, a day of rest. My father is buried up on that ridge, Henderson. My grandfather, too. You tell your board that if they want to dig up that hill, they're going to have to dig through a lot more than just topsoil and granite. They're going to have to dig through me." Henderson smiled, flickered, and died. He sighed, a sound of feigned disappointment that he had practiced in front of mirrors. "It's a lot of money, Artie. More than this whole scrap heap of a town is worth. Don't be a martyr for a pile of rocks." "It ain't about the rocks," Artie replied, stepping closer until he could smell the expensive peppermint on Henderson's breath. "It's about the fact that you think you can buy what you didn't build. You think because you have a piece of paper and a fancy car, the earth just opens up for you. This ground, it's stubborn, it's hard, and it remembers who actually bled for it." Henderson didn't argue. He knew when a conversation had reached its terminal velocity. He just nodded, climbed back into his climate-controlled sanctuary, and backed out of the driveway. As the green mercury disappeared into the fog, Artie remained standing in the middle of the road. He looked up at the ridge, where the dark silhouettes of the pines stood like sentinels against the gray sky. He could almost feel the iron beneath his feet, pulsing like a dark heart, demanding a sacrifice that no amount of money could ever satisfy. He knew then that the peace was over. The quiet desperation of the last few years was about to sharpen into something jagged and lethal. He turned back toward the house, but he didn't go inside. Instead, he walked toward the shed where he kept his tools and his father's old Winchester. The harvest was coming, but it wouldn't be iron they'd be gathering this year. It would be a harvest of hate, grown in the cold, dark furrows of a land that had finally had enough.
The night of November 6th arrived with a brutal, biting wind that roared down from the Canadian border, rattling the corrugated metal roofs of the Iron Range like a rhythmic drum of war. In the heart of Ely, the Rusty Shovel Tavern stood as a sanctuary for the weary and a crucible for the angry. It was a low-slung building, its wooden exterior stained a permanent dark mahogany by decades of soot in road salt. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke a man. The air was a stagnant mixture of blue ribbon beer, cheap sawdust, and the heavy, lingering scent of damp wool and industrial grease. This wasn't a place for celebration. It was a place for mourning the lives that were being stolen one shift at a time. At the far end of the bar, beneath a flickering neon sign that hummed with a low, irritating frequency, sat the Miller cousins, Silas and Boyd. Unlike Artie Gable, who fought with a stoic, quiet dignity, the Millers were men of fire and glass. They were the ones who did the dirty work, the men who had spent 15 years in the deepest pits of the iron vein, their lungs slowly turning to stone from the fine silica dust. Their faces were maps of trauma, etched with the scars of cave-ins and the exhaustion of double shifts. Silas, the elder, gripped a glass of whiskey with a hand that was missing 2 fingers, lost to a conveyor belt back in '68. "I saw Henderson's car again," Boyd muttered, his voice barely audible over the jukebox playing a scratchy Waylon Jennings record. "Parked right outside the sheriff's office. They're greasing the wheels, Silas. You know they are. By next week, they'll have the warrants. They'll have the state troopers. They'll have everything they need to kick us off the claim and bring in their own crews from Duluth." Silas didn't answer immediately. He stared into the amber depths of his drink as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. He thought about the 3 generations of Millers who had died for that ridge. His grandfather had died of black lung at 40. His father had been crushed by a rogue ore car.
The land wasn't just property, it was a graveyard. It was a debt that had been paid in blood, and the thought of a corporation simply writing a check to erase that history made his stomach churn with a cold, acidic fury. The door of the tavern swung open, letting in a blast of sub-zero air and a flurry of snow that hissed as it hit the floorboards. Artie Gable walked in, his face pale and set like concrete. The room went silent. The clinking of glasses stopped, and even the jukebox seemed to lower its volume. Artie didn't go to the bar. He walked straight to the table where the Millers sat. He looked at them, and they saw in their eyes what they felt in their own hearts, the realization that the time for talking had ended. "They cut the power to the upper pump house an hour ago," Artie said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The syndicate claims it was a maintenance issue, but we all know what it is. They're trying to freeze us out. They want the pipes to burst. They want the machinery to seize. They want us to walk away because it's too expensive to stay." Boyd slammed his fist onto the table, causing the glasses to jump. "Let them cut the power. We've got wood. We've got kerosene. We've survived winters that would make those Minneapolis suits cry for their mothers. If they want us out, they're going to have to come and haul us out themselves." "They will," Artie replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily. Henderson wasn't bluffing. "He told me the rigs are coming on the 14th, but I've heard rumors down at the depot. They aren't just bringing drillers, they're bringing security. Men from a private firm out of Chicago. Hard men who don't know the difference between a miner and a trespasser." The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just a dispute over land. It was becoming an invasion. To the men of Ely, the Iron Range was their fortress, and the syndicate was a foreign army trying to scale the walls. They looked at each other, men who had fought, led, and worked together for decades. There was a silent communication in those looks, an ancient tribal understanding that when the wolves are at the gate, you don't call the shepherd, you sharpen your knife. Silas finally looked up, his one good eye squinting in the dim light. "We've got the old caches from the strike of '72, he whispered. "The dynamite we borrowed from the blasting crew. It's still dry. It's still stable enough." Artie leaned in, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "We aren't terrorists, Silas. We're owners. We're defenders." "In their eyes, there's no difference," Silas countered. "To them, we're just an obstacle on a balance sheet. We're a line item that needs to be deleted. If we wait for the 14th, we've already lost. We need to show them that the Iron Vein doesn't belong to a board of directors. It belongs to the men who know how to make it scream." Outside, the wind intensified, howling through the gaps in the tavern siding, sounding like a chorus of the damned. The men in the rusty shovel began to gather around the table, a circle of weathered faces and hard eyes. There was no talk of the law. There was no talk of the sheriff. Sheriff Miller was one of them, but his badge was tied to a system that had already betrayed them. They knew that when the first shot was fired, he would be caught in the middle, and they didn't want to make him choose. Artie looked around the circle. He saw the desperation. He saw the pride. And most of all, he saw the exhaustion. They were tired of being small. They were tired of being Boer. And they were tired of being invisible. Tonight, in the flickering amber light of a dying mining town, they were making a pact that would lead them all into the mouth of the abyss. "Fine," Artie said, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "If they want to fight, we'll give them one they'll never forget. We'll meet at the ridge tomorrow at midnight. Bring everything you have. We're going to secure the perimeter, and if Henderson or his dogs set foot on that ground, we'll ensure they never leave it." The pact was sealed with a round of whiskey that tasted like fire and iron. They drank in silence, the gravity of their decision settling over them like a layer of frost. They knew that by this time next week, some of them would be dead, and the rest would be changed forever. But as they stepped back out into the freezing Minnesota night, they felt a strange, terrifying sense of purpose. For the first time in years, they weren't just victims of the economy. They were the masters of their own violent destiny. The Iron Vein was waiting for them in the dark, its deep, silent chambers ready to echo with the sound of a struggle that would stain the snow red for miles. The storm was no longer just outside, it was inside them, and it was about to break.
The night of November 7th was a hollow, echoing chamber of freezing fog. In the back of Artie Gable's machine shop, a rusted corrugated shed that sat on the edge of the forest, the temperature had dropped so low that the oil in the cans had turned to a thick, translucent jelly. This was the sanctuary of the desperate. The interior was lit by a single swaying industrial bulb that cast long, distorted shadows
against walls lined with wrenches, saw blades, and the skeletal remains of old engine blocks. The air was a suffocating cocktail of kerosene fumes, cold iron, and the sharp, nose-stinging scent of gun oil. Artie stood over a workbench made of heavy oak planks, his breath coming in steady, rhythmic puffs of white vapor. Spread out before him was the inheritance of a violent century. There was his father's Winchester Model 1894, its walnut stock scarred and darkened by decades of sweat and rain. Beside it lay a pair of Remington 870 shotguns, their Parkerized barrels dull and non-reflective in the dim light. These weren't the polished toys of weekend hunters. These were tools of survival, maintained with the same grim precision a surgeon might apply to his scalpels. Silas Miller stood in the corner, his silhouette lost among the hanging chains and pulleys. He was working on a different kind of equipment. On a crate of blasting caps, he was carefully measuring out lengths of fuse. Each movement was agonizingly slow. In the Iron Range, every man knew the power of dynamite. It was the force that broke the earth to give them their living, but it was also the force that had buried their friends in sudden, thunderous cave-ins. To Silas, the oily sticks of red diamond explosives felt like living things, pulsing with a volatile energy that mirrored the rage in his own chest. "You think we can actually hold the ridge, Artie?" Silas asked, his voice sounding thin and metallic in the cramped space. He didn't look up from his work. "The Syndicate has more than just security. I heard they've been coordinating with the rail guards in Duluth. They're coming with numbers we haven't seen since the riots in '34. Artie didn't answer immediately. He was busy feeding 30-30 rounds into the side gate of the Winchester. Click, click, click. Each round was a heavy, brass-jacketed prize. "It's not about holding the ridge forever, Silas. It's about making the cost of taking it more than they're willing to pay. These corporate bastards, they understand math. They understand profit and loss. We just have to make sure the loss side of their ledger is written in something they can't ignore." He picked up a box of shells, the cardboard damp and soft from the humidity. The labels were faded, ammunition bought back when the mines were still booming, and the future seemed like something you could actually plan for. Now, the future was a narrow tunnel with no light at the end. "They'll call us criminals," Silas muttered, his missing fingers fumbling slightly with a crimping tool. "The papers in Minneapolis, they'll say we're just disgruntled workers, crazy hilljacks who couldn't handle the change. They'll make us the villains of the story before the first drop of blood even hits the snow." Artie finally looked up, his eyes two dark pits of exhaustion. "Let them. History is written by the winners, but legends are told by the people who stood their ground. I don't care what a reporter in a heated office thinks about me. I care about the fact that my grandson won't have a place to call home if I let Henderson walk all over us. We're not fighting for the Syndicate's approval. We're fighting for the right to exist in the place where we were born." The sound of a distant whistle from a passing ore train drifted through the cracks in the shed walls, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to signal the end of an era. It was a reminder that the world outside was still moving, still consuming, still demanding the iron that sat beneath their feet. The industrial machine didn't care about family lines or ancestral woodlots. It only cared about the raw materials required to keep the gears turning. Boyd Miller entered the shed, his face flushed red from the cold. He was carrying a crate of old military surplus gas masks, their rubber faces cracked and smelling of old rubber and stagnant air. "I got these from the old civil defense shelter at the school," he said, breathing hard. "If they try to smoke us out with tear gas, we'll be ready. I also talked to the boys at the power substation. They can't officially help us, but they accidentally misplaced the schematics for the main line to the Syndicate's temporary camp. If we need to plunge that whole valley into darkness, it's just one switch away." The three men stood in the center of the shed, a grim tableau of American defiance. They were no longer just miners or farmers. They were a militia of the dispossessed. The transformation was complete. The tools of their trade had been replaced by the weapons of a feud. The machine shop had become an armory, and the town of Ellie had become a powder keg with a very short fuse. Artie reached out and turned off the swaying light bulb. The darkness swallowed them instantly, leaving only the faint, ghostly glow of the snow outside the window. "Midnight tomorrow,"
Artie whispered. "At the old number 9 shaft. No lights, no radio. We wait until they cross the fence. Once they're on our dirt, the law ends and the range begins." They moved out of the shed like shadows, disappearing into the fog. Behind them, the Winchester and the dynamite sat in the dark, waiting for the moment when they would be called upon to speak for the silent men of Minnesota. The wind picked up, a low, guttural moan that shook the trees, as if the earth itself was bracing for the violence that was about to be unleashed upon its surface. The harvest was ready, and the reapers were in position.
The midnight of November 8th was a void. There was no moon to silver the pines, only a suffocating, ink-black darkness that seemed to swallow the very light of the stars. At the eastern edge of the Gable property, the disputed Section 14, the old iron fence line stood like a row of skeletal fingers poking out of the frozen crust of the earth. This was the line. On one side lay the ancestral soil of men who had lived and died by the seasons. On the other, the encroaching machinery of a ghost-owned corporation. Artie Gable lay prone on a ridge of limestone and frozen moss, his chest pressed against the frigid ground. The wool of his coat was already stiffening with frost, but he didn't feel the cold. His heart was a drum, beating a slow, heavy rhythm that echoed in his ears. Beside him, Silas Miller gripped his Winchester, the barrel wrapped in dark friction tape to prevent any glint of light from betraying their position. They were motionless, two statues of shadow overlooking the access road that wound up from the valley floor. The silence was broken by a sound that didn't belong to the woods. It was a low, mechanical hum, the guttural vibration of heavy engines struggling against the incline. Then came the lights. Two sets of powerful halogen beams cut through the fog like twin sabers, sweeping across the trunks of the ancient maples. A pair of heavy-duty Chevy Blazers, painted a sterile corporate white, crawled up the path. Behind them, a flatbed truck groaned under the weight of a portable generator and crates of equipment. "They're early," Silas whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Bastards didn't even wait for the 14th. They're trying to seize the ground while they think we're sleeping." "Stay steady," Artie commanded, his voice barely a breath. "Don't move until they hit the wire. We need them to commit. We need them to be the ones who break the peace." The lead Blazer stopped exactly 3 feet from the rusted wire fence. The engines remained idling, sending plumes of gray exhaust swirling into the headlights. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. 4 men stepped out into the biting Minnesota air. They weren't dressed like miners or locals. They wore tactical nylon jackets, heavy boots, and headsets. These were the security Henderson had threatened. Hired muscle from the city. Men who looked at the woods and saw only a job site to be cleared. In the center of the group was a man in a long, dark overcoat. Even in the dim light, Artie recognized the silhouette. It was Henderson. He looked smaller here, out of his Mercury Marquise and away from his mahogany desk, but his arrogance still radiated off him like heat. He pulled a flashlight from his pocket and shone it directly onto the fence, the beam lingering on the private property, no trespassing sign that Artie had nailed to a post only hours before. "Tear it down!" Henderson's voice carried through the crisp air, sounding thin and tinny. The injunction was signed at 5 o'clock today. This isn't their land anymore. It's an asset. Clear the path for the trucks. 2 of the security guards stepped forward. One carried a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. The metallic clack as he opened the jaws of the tool sounded like a hammer being cocked. He reached for the wire Artie's grandfather had strung by hand in 1932. Crack. The sound of the shot wasn't a roar. In the heavy, damp air, it was a sharp, biting snap. Artie hadn't fired at the men. He had fired into the engine block of the lead Blazer. A geyser of steam and sparks erupted from under the Chevy's hood, hissed violently, and then died. The reaction was instantaneous. The security guards dove for cover behind the doors of their vehicles, their hands disappearing into their jackets for sidearms. Henderson let out a strangled yelp and scrambled back into the passenger seat, his dignity vanishing as he crawled over the center console. "The next one doesn't hit the iron," Artie yelled, his voice booming from the ridge, amplified by the natural bull of the valley. "You're standing on Gable blood, Henderson.
There is no injunction that can overrule the dirt under your feet. Turn those trucks around or you'll be leaving them here as monuments. Gable, you're a dead man, one of the guards screamed, firing a blind shot into the tree line. The bullet tore through a pine branch 3 feet above Silas's head, showering him in needles and ice. Don't fire back, I hissed at Silas, grabbing his arm. Not yet. Let them waste their lead on the shadows. A searchlight on top of the second blazer snapped on, a blinding white eye that began to scan the reg. It was a high-intensity beam designed to disorient and terrify. Artie squinted, the light searing his retinas. I could hear the guards shouting to each other, frantic, disorganized chatter that told him they weren't prepared for an armed ambush. They had expected a few angry farmers with signs, not a disciplined line of men who knew the terrain like the back of their hands. You can't hide forever, Artie. Henderson's voice came through a megaphone now, distorted and booming. The sheriff is on his way. You're making this a federal matter. Drop your weapons and we can still settle this with the bank. Bank didn't build this town, Lloyd Miller's voice echoed from the opposite side of the road, and the bank is gonna be the one to bury you. Suddenly, a series of small, controlled explosions rocked the hillside behind the trucks. It wasn't the dynamite Silas had prepared for the mine. It was bird bombs, loud pyrotechnic charges used to scare away crows. In the dead of night, they sounded like a mortar barrage. The psychological effect was devastating. The driver of the flatbed truck, a local man who was only there for the paycheck, panicked. He slammed the vehicle into reverse, the tires spinning wildly in the slush, and jackknifed the trailer across the narrow road, completely blocking the exit. The valley was suddenly a theater of chaos. Steam hissed from the ruined blazer, the searchlight swung wildly through the trees, and the air was filled with the smell of burned powder and ozone. For a few seconds, the power of the syndicate was broken by the sheer, stubborn will of 3 men in wool coats. Retreat! Henderson screamed from inside the blazer. Get us out of here, now! The guards didn't need to be told twice. They piled back into the second vehicle, leaving the ruined lead car and the jackknifed flatbed behind. The second blazer roared, tires screaming as it backed down the steep incline, disappearing into the fog from which it had emerged. The silence returned to the ridge, but it wasn't a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a wound that had just been opened. Artie stood up, his legs shaking from the adrenaline. He looked down at the abandoned machinery, the steam still rising from the engine like the breath of a dying beast. They'll be back, Silas said, standing up and brushing the snow from his sleeves. He wasn't smiling. And next time, they won't bring lawyers. They'll bring the National Guard, or worse. Artie looked at his rifle, then at the dark line of the woods. I know, he said softly, but tonight the fence is still standing. And for men like us, Silas, tonight is all we ever really had. The first skirmish of the Iron Vein Massacre had ended. No blood had been spilled yet, but the air felt heavy with the promise of it. The lines had been drawn not just in the dirt, but in the souls of every man in Ellie. The war for the North Woods had begun.
The morning after the skirmish at the ridge, the sun remained a prisoner behind a thick, iron-gray veil of sleet. The town of Ely didn't wake up so much as it emerged, shivering and suspicious from a fitful sleep. By 8 a.m., the news of the shot fired at Henderson's vehicle had rippled through every kitchen and workshop like a cold current. The air in the local diner, usually filled with the clatter of silverware and talk of the upcoming hockey season, was now heavy with a suffocating, leaden dread. People didn't look each other in the eye. They looked at the floor, at their coffee, or out the window toward the dark, jagged silhouette of the Iron Range. Inside the sheriff's office, the heat was cranked up so high the air felt scorched, yet Sheriff Elias Miller couldn't stop shivering. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, staring at a stack of legal injunctions and arrest warrants that had been delivered by a state courier at dawn. His badge, pinned to a shirt that smelled of stale sweat and cold tobacco, felt like a hot coal pressed against his chest. On the wall behind him, a map of the county was pinned with red markers, each one representing a point of tension, a disputed boundary, a place where the earth was ready to open up and swallow his friends. The door to the office slammed open, rattling the glass panes. It was Henderson. He looked different today. The polished arrogance of the previous week had been replaced by a jagged, twitching fury. His expensive overcoat was stained with mud, and there was a dark bruise forming on his forehead where he had hit the dashboard during the retreat. I want them in chains, Miller, Henderson screamed, slamming his briefcase onto the desk.
I want Artie Gable, the Miller cousins, and every other backwoods insurgent on that ridge arrested for attempted murder and domestic terrorism. Do you have any idea what kind of pressure is coming down from Duluth? The syndicate is calling the governor's office as we speak. Miller didn't look up. He slowly uncapped a thermos and poured a stream of lukewarm coffee into a tin mug. You brought armed men onto a disputed property in the dead of night, Henderson. In this part of the country, that's called trespassing. Artie didn't shoot a person. He shot a piece of machinery that was violating his fence line. My deputies found the casing. It's a warning, not a massacre. A warning? Henderson's voice hit a high, hysterical pitch. They used explosives. They sabotaged a transport truck. My men are professionals, and they were forced to retreat by a pack of animals hiding in the bushes. If you won't do your job, the state police will, and they won't be as understanding of the local folklore as you are. Miller finally looked up, his eyes two cold gray stones. My job is to keep the peace, not to act as a private militia for a mining company that hasn't paid its local taxes in 3 years. You think you're the first man to come up here with a briefcase and a temper? The range has buried better men than you, Henderson. It eats them for breakfast. Is that a threat, Sheriff? Henderson hissed, leaning over the desk until his face was inches from Miller's. It's a weather report, Miller replied flatly. The temperature is dropping. The people in this town are cold, they're broke, and they're tired of being told that their grandfather's graves are assets on a spreadsheet. You pushed them. Now the momentum is out of my hands. If I go up there to arrest Artie today, I'll have 100 miners blocking the road with hunting rifles. Do you want a civil war? Because that's exactly what you're building. Henderson straightened his coat, his hands trembling. The rigs are moving in tomorrow at noon, with or without your escort. If a single shot is fired, the blood is on your hands, Miller. You chose your side. Just remember that when the indictments start flying. Local loyalty doesn't hold much weight in a federal courtroom. Henderson stormed out, leaving the office in a vacuum of silence. Miller leaned back, closing his eyes. He thought of Artie Gable. They had played football together in high school. He had been the best man at Artie's wedding. He knew the shape of Artie's soul. It was a stubborn, honest thing, built on the belief that a man's word and his land were the only things that truly belonged to him. But the law didn't care about friendship. The law was a cold, indifferent machine, and Miller was the man tasked with oiling the gears. He stood up and walked to the window. Across the street, he saw a group of men standing outside the hardware store. They were dressed in their work clothes, greasy caps, heavy boots, denim jackets. They weren't talking. They were just standing there, watching his office. They were waiting to see which way the sheriff would jump. In their eyes, he wasn't Elias anymore. He was the badge. He was the enemy's representative. The fracture wasn't just in the town. It was inside him. He felt the community tearing apart, the invisible threads of trust and shared history snapping one by one. Neighbors who had shared tools for 20 years were now locking their gates. The local priest had closed the church doors after receiving threats for praying for both sides. The iron vein hadn't even been tapped yet, and it was already poisoning the water. Miller reached for his hat and his heavy winter coat. He knew he had to go to the Gables farm, not as a sheriff, but as a man. He had to try one last time to talk Artie down before the state police arrived with their armored vans with their tear gas. But as he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the wind caught the door, slamming it shut with a sound that echoed like a final iron door closing on the past. The town of Ely was no longer a home. It was a battlefield, and the first casualty was the truth that they were all on the same side. As Miller climbed into his cruiser, he saw a young boy, maybe 10 years old, standing on the corner. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched the sheriff with a hollow, haunted expression that said more than any legal injunction ever could. The children were learning the lessons of the feud, and those lessons were written in ice and resentment. The road to the Gable farm was a long, winding path through the pines, and as Miller drove, he felt the weight of the forest pressing in on him. The trees seemed to lean over the road, their branches heavy with the coming storm. The Iron Range was waiting. It was hungry, and tomorrow at noon, it was going to be fed.
The afternoon of November 9th brought a sudden, eerie stillness to the Iron Range. The wind had died down, leaving the forest trapped in a cold, crystalline silence that felt fragile, as if the world might shatter at the slightest sound. But on the Gable farm, the silence was broken by the frantic, panicked lowing of cattle. Artie Gable was in the barn, sharpening a mower blade, when the sound reached him. A guttural, terrified noise that signaled something was wrong on the eastern pasture, the patch of land that bordered the syndicate's newly bulldozed access road. Artie didn't grab his tools. He grabbed the Winchester.
He ran across the frozen mud of the yard, his lungs burning as he sucked in the sub-zero air. When he reached the rise overlooking the valley, he saw them. 3 of his prize Herefords were tangled in a new high-tension wire fence that hadn't been there the night before. The syndicate's contractors had returned under the cover of the morning fog, not to drill, but to secure the perimeter with razor-tipped wire that was never meant for livestock. One of the cows, a heavy breeder Artie had raised from a calf, was thrashing violently, the silver barbs tearing deep furrows into her hide. The snow beneath her was no longer white. It was a spreading, steaming pool of brilliant crimson. Standing 20 yards away, on the other side of the wire, were 2 of Henderson's security guards. They weren't helping. They were leaning against their white truck, smoking cigarettes, watching the animal die with a casual, bored indifference that made Artie's vision tunnel into a pinpoint of white-hot rage. "Cut the wire!" Artie screamed, his voice cracking with emotion as he slid down the embankment. "She's gutting herself on your goddamn fence! Open the gate or cut the wire!" The taller of the 2 guards, a man with a scarred jaw and cold, dead eyes, didn't move. He took a long drag of his cigarette and exhaled a plume of blue smoke into the freezing air. "Can't do that, Pops," he said, his voice flat and mocking. "This is a legal boundary. Anything on this side of the wire is a trespasser. Your cow jumped the line. That makes it a syndicate liability issue." "She didn't jump anything," Artie roared, reaching the fence. He could see the cow's eyes rolling back in its head, the breath coming in wet, bloody gasps. "You moved the line 50 feet into my grazing land. You trapped her." Artie reached for the wire with his bare hands, desperate to pull the barbs away from the animal's throat. "Step back, Gable," the second guard warned, his hand moving to the holster on his hip. "You touch that fence, and you're interfering with private industrial property. We have orders to use force to protect company assets." Artie didn't stop. He gripped the wire, the razor-sharp steel slicing through his palms, but he didn't feel the pain. He pulled with everything he had, the tension in the wire humming like a guitar string. The cow gave a final agonizing heave, a spray of hot blood hitting Artie's face and chest. Then she went limp. The only sound was the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of blood hitting the frozen earth, and the soft, metallic ticking of the truck's cooling engine. Artie stood there, his hands dripping red, his face splattered with the life of the animal he had spent years protecting. He looked down at the Hereford, then up at the guards. The rage wasn't a fire anymore. It was an iceberg, cold and immovable. "You killed her for a foot of dirt," Artie whispered, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "It's just a cow, Gable," the tall guard said, tossing his cigarette butt into the bloodstained snow. "Send the bill to the Duluth office. Maybe they'll buy you a steak." The 2 guards laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the frozen pines. It was the sound of a world that had lost its soul. It was the sound of the city mocking the land. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the tree line behind Artie. Silas Miller stepped out, his face a mask of cold fury. He wasn't alone. 3 other miners, armed with heavy iron pry bars and shotguns, emerged from the fog like ghosts of the rain. They didn't say a word. They just stood there, a wall of weathered denim and iron, their eyes fixed on the guards. The guards' laughter died instantly. They realized, too late, that they were miles from any backup, trapped in a landscape that hated them, facing men who had nothing left to lose. The tall guard's hand hovered over his pistol, but his fingers were shaking. He looked at the 5 men, then at the dead cow, and back at the men. He saw the Winchester in Artie's blood-stained hand, and for the first time, he saw the reality of the situation. In the city, he had the law. Out here, in the Iron Range, he only had what he could defend. "We're leaving," the tall guard muttered, his voice losing its edge. "But this ain't over. You're all going to jail for this." "Leave the truck," Artie said, stepping forward. The blood on his face was beginning to freeze into dark, jagged streaks. "What?" the guard stammered. "I said leave the truck," Artie repeated, raising the Winchester until the front sight was centered on the guard's chest. "Consider it payment for the cow. Now walk. Walk back to your master, and tell him that the next thing that touches this fence won't be a beast. It'll be a man, and I won't be trying to save him." The guards hesitated, but the look in Artie's eyes was something they couldn't fight. It was the look of a man who had already passed the point of no return. They turned and began the long, humiliating walk down the access road, their polished boots slipping on the ice. Artie stood there by the dead Hereford until the sound of their footsteps vanished. He looked down at his hands, shredded, bloody, and cold. Silas walked up beside him and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "The peace is gone, Artie," Silas said softly. "There's no coming back from this. I know.
Artie replied, looking towards the ridge where the syndicate's lights were already beginning to flicker in the distance. But they needed to know. They needed to see that we aren't just names on a list. We bleed, and so do they. He knelt in the snow and began the grim task of unhooking the dead animal from the wire. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the Iron Range. The sacrifice had been made. The ground had tasted blood, and now it was waiting for the rest. The Iron Vein Massacre was no longer a possibility. It had begun, and the harvest of 1976 was going to be the most bitter the North had ever seen.
The evening of November 9th transformed into a thick, stagnant fog that smelled of wet iron, stagnant grease, and the cold breath of a dying season. Inside Sheriff Elias Miller's office, a silence reigned that was so absolute it felt physical, a pressurized vacuum that made the ears pop. The only sounds were the rhythmic, unhealthy hiss of the old radio transmitter and the occasional metallic pop of an electric space heater struggling against the sub-zero draft. Miller sat behind his desk, his head cradled in hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Before him lay his badge, a 7-pointed star that had once represented the armor of the law, but now looked like a piece of discarded tin, stripped of all weight and meaning. The door groaned on its hinges, and Arthur Gable stepped into the room. He didn't take off his hat, and he didn't offer a greeting. His hands were wrapped in grimy strips of canvas, the white fabric stained with the dark rust-colored patches of dried blood from the afternoon's tragedy on the ridge. He stood in the center of the office, a towering silhouette of denim and resentment, looking at the sheriff with eyes that had seen the end of the world and decided to survive it. "They slaughtered my stock, Elias." Arthur's voice was low, vibrating with a tectonic fury that seemed to shake the floorboards. "They stood there on that access road, smoking their city cigarettes, and they laughed while my Hereford gutted herself on their wire. I didn't come here to file a report. I didn't come here to cry. I came to ask a single question. Are you going to arrest them? For criminal trespass, for the destruction of property, for the violation of a century of peace?" Miller slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites turned a sickly yellow from exhaustion and the cheap fluorescent light humming above. He reached out with a trembling finger and pushed a stack of papers across the desk. The documents were crisp, white, and bore the heavy blue seal of the state attorney general. "I can't, Artie," Miller whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "Those came in by courier at sunset. It's an administrative injunction. The district court has reclassified your eastern acreage as a zone of strategic industrial interest. All your previous claims of trespass have been vacated. Worse than that, there's an active warrant in that pile for your arrest. They're citing criminal trespass for interference with interstate commerce and armed intimidation. In the eyes of the state of Minnesota, you aren't a farmer defending his fence anymore. You're a domestic insurgent." Gable let out a short, jagged bark of a laugh, a sound devoid of mirth, sounding more like a dog choking on a bone. "An insurgent, on the land my grandfather cleared with a team of mules. So that's the way the wind blows now. The law protects the men who string razor wire through living flesh, and it hunts the men who try to stop them." "The law protects the interests that pay for the law, Artie," Miller said, standing up and walking to the window. He stared out at the dark streets of Ely, where the salt-crusted trucks were already gathering in the shadows. "I called Duluth. I called St. Paul. I even tried to get hold of the governor's aide. They told me to stand down. They said if I can't guarantee the safety of the syndicate's equipment, they'll bypass my office entirely and send in the state patrol's tactical units. They don't want a resolution, Artie. They want the ore, and they've decided that you're just a layer of overburden that needs to be stripped away." Arthur walked to the desk, leaning over until he was inches from Miller's face. The smell of wood smoke and old blood wafted off his coat. "So you're washing your hands of it? You're going to sit here in your heated office while they bring the bulldozers onto my porch?" Miller turned around, and for the first time, Artie didn't see cowardice in the sheriff's eyes. He saw a profound, terminal exhaustion. It was the look of a man who had realized he was a ghost in his own town. "I'm not going to arrest you, Artie," Miller said, his voice flat and dead. "But I can't shield you either. If I go up to that ridge with my deputies to stand with you, I'm a traitor to the state. If I go up there to pull you out, I'm a traitor to my blood.
My badge doesn't mean a damn thing tonight. There is no law in Ely anymore. There is only you, your people, and the syndicate. The middle ground just collapsed into the mine. The sheriff reached for his belt, unbuckled the heavy leather holster and the gleaming badge, and dropped them onto the oak desk with a heavy, final thud. It was the sound of a century of order being extinguished. In that small, dimly lit office, civilization had officially ended. What remained was the primal math of the North, tooth for tooth, iron for iron. So, every man for himself, Gable said. He turned and walked toward the door, his boots thumping against the floor with the weight of a funeral march. "Artie," Miller called out, as Gable reached the threshold. "If you do this, if you go to the number 9 shaft tonight, there is no path back. They won't just defeat you. They'll erase you. They'll make sure the name Cable is something people are afraid to whisper in the streets." Cable stopped, but he didn't turn around. His shadow stretched long and jagged across the office floor, looking like a crack in the foundation of the building. "They're already doing that, Elias. They're erasing us with their pens and their lawyers and their strategic interests. The only difference is that I'm not going to die in a whisper. If they want this iron, they're going to have to taste it first."
The night of November 10th, 1976 brought more than just cold. It brought a visceral sense of finality. The temperature plummeted so sharply that the trunks of the ancient white pines began to crack under the internal pressure of the frost, emitting sharp, rhythmic snaps that sounded like distant pistol fire echoing through the valley. The sky over Ely turned a suffocating, impenetrable black, save for the sickly orange glow emanating from the syndicate's floodlights in the valley below. But up on the ridge, at the mouth of the number 9 shaft, there was only shadow. Artie Gable and his men kept no fires. They sat in the lee of rusted ore bins and skeletal headframes, waiting for the moment when nature's fury and human resentment would finally collide. Artie stood at the precipice of the mine entrance, his fingers curled around the cold walnut stock of his Winchester, as if it were the only living thing left to trust. His bandaged hands had long since gone numb, the blood-soaked canvas wrappings frozen into stiff white husks, but he didn't feel the sting. He watched as the first flakes of snow, heavy, jagged, and sharp as shards of industrial glass, began to swirl in the air. This wasn't a common flurry. It was the arrival of a North Country white terror, a blizzard designed to bury the living and the dead alike under a shroud of indifferent white. "They're moving the heavy armor to the base of the incline," Silas Miller whispered, appearing from the darkness like a ghost made of frost and denim. His beard was matted with ice, and his breath billowed in thick, ragged plumes. "I saw the sweep of their halogens through the glass. There are at least 30 of them, Artie, and they aren't carrying riot batons anymore. I saw the silhouettes of long guns, automatic rifles. This isn't a security detail. It's a liquidation squad." Artie nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the lights below. "They think the storm will drive us off the ridge. They think we're soft enough to value our lives over the dirt we stand on. They've forgotten that we were born in this frost, Silas. To them, this cold is an enemy. To us, it's a sanctuary. It's the only witness we need." Inside the mine yard, the atmosphere was one of doomed mechanical precision. Boyd Liller and 2 other miners were crouched over a grate of high-velocity dynamite they had hauled up from the 400-foot level. They were wrapping the blasting caps with black friction tape, their movements slow and deliberate. Each man knew that once these charges were set, the number 9 would either become their fortress or their tomb. There was no middle ground left in the Iron Range. There was only the victory of the soil or the silence of the grave. "Did you leave a note for Martha?" Artie asked suddenly, leaning against a rusted conveyor support and cupping a cigarette in his palms to hide the cherry-red glow. Artie flinched, the image of his wife sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee while the wind rattled the window panes, pierced him more deeply than the sub-zero air. "No," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "If I make it down, I won't need a note. If I don't, she'll know why. She knows a man can't just give away his soul and expect to keep living. If you let them take the land your father bled into, you're just a hollow shell waiting for the wind to blow you over." The snow intensified, creating a vertical wall of white that severed the ridge from the rest of civilization. The mechanical hum of the engines in the valley became muffled,
transforming into a surreal metallic heartbeat. In that moment, Artie felt a terrifying sense of peace. The world had shrunk to the size of this ridge, to the weight of the rifle in his hands, and to the warmth of the few men standing beside him. The lawyers, the injunctions, and the syndicate's balance sheets had all vanished into the storm. There was only the earth and the blood. "Listen," Artie said, raising a hand. A new sound drifted up from the white abyss. It wasn't the roar of an engine. It was the rising, mournful wail of a siren, a long, agonizing tone that tore through the blizzard. It was the signal. The syndicate had decided not to wait for the dawn. They were betting that the storm would mask their advance, just as Artie hoped it would mask his defense. "To your positions," Artie's command rolled across the yard like a thunderclap. "Hold your fire until they hit the wire. I want them to see the whites of our eyes before the iron starts speaking. Let them know that the Iron Range doesn't sell out. It fights back." The men dispersed like shadows into the whiteout. Some took cover behind rusted ore cars. Others climbed the slick, icy ladders of the headframe. Silas vanished into the dark maw of the shaft, clutching the lead wires of the blasting machine. Artie remained at the very edge of the embankment, staring into the white void. He saw the first beams of the tactical flashlights cutting through the snow, slow, rhythmic sweeps of light, like the eyes of a great iron beast coming to reclaim its prey. Artie's heart beat with a slow, rhythmic calm. He knew the next few hours would stain the history of Minnesota forever. He knew the morning papers would call them murderers, lunatics, and relics of a dead age. But here, 1,000 feet above the world, in the heart of a frozen hell, he felt truly free for the first time in his life. The snow settled on his shoulders, coating him in white, turning him into a living extension of the ridge itself. The massacre was no longer a shadow. It was the reality of the next breath. The first beam of a searchlight caught the rusted iron of the gate, and Artie brought the Winchester to his shoulder. The gold steel of the barrel pressed against his cheek, and in that contact, he felt the strength of every Gable who had ever swung a pick or held a plow. "Come on, then," he whispered into the biting wind. "Come and take what you think belongs to you. See what the earth has to say about it." At that moment, the first shot shattered the frozen silence, and the iron vein erupted in fire, lead, and screams. The blizzard had finally received what it craved, the heat of human blood to melt the falling snow.
The first shot was a lonely, echoing crack that seemed to fracture the very air of the ridge. It didn't come from the miners. It came from the darkness below, a high-velocity round that shattered the frosted glass of the mine's old way station. For a heartbeat, there was a vacuum of silence, and then the night disintegrated. The Syndicate's security forces, moving in a disciplined wedge, unleashed a wall of fire. The rhythmic, mechanical stutter of automatic weapons tore through the blizzard, the muzzle flashes illuminating the falling snow like strobes in a nightmare. Tracers burned through the whiteout, glowing lines of phosphorus that hissed as they cut through the freezing mist. "Open up!" Artie roared, his voice barely audible over the sudden cacophony of war. From behind the rusted hull of a 1954 ore car, Silas and Boyd Miller responded. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a 10-gauge shotgun joined the sharp, desperate barks of deer rifles. They weren't firing at men. They were firing at the flashes of light, at the shadows that dared to breach the perimeter of the number 9. The air was instantly filled with the acrid, metallic stench of burnt cordite and the sweet, sickening smell of ozone. The snow, once a pristine white shroud, was being churned into a gray, slushy filth by the heat of the exchange. One of the Syndicate's lead men, a man in a black tactical parka, reached the rusted wire fence. He didn't have bolt cutters this time. He had a breaching charge. He slapped the explosive against the gatepost, but before he could retreat, a round from Artie's Winchester found its mark. The man spun, his legs kicking out from under him on the black ice, and he slumped against the wire. His blood, hot and steaming, sprayed across the metal barbs, the very same barbs that had claimed Artie's Hereford only days before. The irony was silent, buried under the roar of the guns. "They're flanking the North Hoist House," Boyd screamed, his face blackened by powder burns. He pointed toward a group of silhouettes moving through the skeletal shadows of the conveyor belts. Artie didn't hesitate. He swung the Winchester toward the movement, his frozen fingers working the lever action with a primal muscle memory fluidness. Cycle, aim, fire,
Cycle. Each recoil punched into his shoulder, a jarring reminder that he was still alive. He saw a shadow fall, tumbling over a pile of slag, but 3 more took its place. These weren't the frightened guards from the road. These were men paid to finish a job, and they were moving with a cold professional lethargy that was more terrifying than rage. Suddenly, a blinding white light erupted from the base of the ridge. The syndicate had managed to set up a portable military-grade searchlight. The beam was so powerful it felt like a physical blow, washing out the world and turning the miners into perfect, high-contrast targets against the dark iron structures. "Get the light," Silas yelled, ducking as a burst of fire chewed through the wooden siding of the shed next to him, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. "Artie, we can't see the sights." Artie squinted against the glare, his eyes watering from the intensity. He felt the sting of a grazing round sip past his ear, the heat of it momentarily warming his skin. He realized then that they were being pinned down. The superior firepower of the syndicate was beginning to tell. The math Henderson had talked about was playing out in real time. More lead, more light, more bodies. "Silas, the shaft wires," Artie bellowed, signaling toward the dark mouth of the mine. Silas understood. He crawled through the slush, dragging himself toward the detonator box hidden behind a granite outcropping. If they couldn't win the firefight, they would change the battlefield. The plan was desperate. A series of controlled collapses to block the main access paths and douse the lights in a landslide of rock and iron. But as Silas reached for the plunger, a flashbang grenade tossed by an advancing guard exploded 10 feet away. The world turned into a white, ringing void. Silas was thrown backward, his head hitting the iron rail of the ore track. He lay there, dazed, as the syndicate guards crested the rise, their boots crunching on the frozen gravel. Artie saw his friend go down. He stood up from his cover, abandoning the safety of the ore car. He wasn't thinking about the land anymore. He wasn't thinking about the iron or the syndicate. He was a man of the range, and his brother was bleeding in the dirt. He fired the Winchester from the hip, the lever moving in a blur, forcing the guards to dive for cover. "Get up, Silas," Artie screamed, his voice raw and breaking. The searchlight swung around, pinning Artie in its center. For a second, he looked like a saint in a halo of electric light, a man made of frost and fury. The guards paused, momentarily awed by the sheer, suicidal defiance of the farmer. Then, the lead guard raised his rifle. The first bullet of the true massacre struck the iron head frame above Artie's head, showering him in rust. The second struck the earth at his feet. Standoff had ended. The execution had begun. In the distance, the siren continued to wail, a mournful dirge for the 12 men who would never leave the ridge alive. The snow continued to fall, faster now, trying to bury the violence as quickly as it was being born.
The night air, once crisp and frozen, had become a thick, choking soup of chemical smoke and the iron-scented mist of atomized blood. The number 9 ridge was no longer a piece of Minnesota geography. It had become a localized hell, a frantic geometry of muzzle flashes and dying screams. As Artie Gable stood pinned in the white glare of the syndicate searchlight, the world slowed down. He could hear the individual grains of sleet hitting his wool coat, sounding like sand against a coffin lid. He saw the lead guard's finger tighten on the trigger of an M16, a weapon designed for the jungles of Vietnam, now brought to the quiet woods of the North to settle a debt of dirt and greed. The burst of fire was a rhythmic, mechanical stutter, rat-tat-tat-tat. The rounds didn't hit Artie. They chewed through the wooden support beam inches from his shoulder, spraying him with a cloud of ancient, bone-dry splinters. The force of the near miss knocked him sideways, sending him sprawling into the slush beside Silas. "Silas, wake up, damn you!" Artie roared, grabbing the front of Silas's coat and hauling him toward the heavy iron base of the mine's winch. Silas groaned, blood leaking from a jagged cut on his forehead, turning his gray beard a brilliant, wet crimson. His eyes were unfocused, reflecting the chaotic strobes of the firefight. "The wires, Artie. I lost the damn wires," he wheezed, his breath rattling in a chest that had seen too many years of silica dust. High above them, on the catwalk of the headframe, Boyd Miller was making his final stand. He had a hunting rifle in one hand and a flare gun in the other.
He saw the syndicate guards moving in a disciplined line, using the searchlight as a shield to advance toward the mine entrance. They were less than 30 yards away now, their silhouettes jagged and predatory against the whiteout. Boyd knew the math. He knew they were being flanked. "For the range!" Boyd's voice screamed out from the darkness of the rafters. He didn't fire at the men. He fired the flare gun directly into the generator that powered the searchlight. The magnesium flare struck the fuel tank with a spectacular, violent eruption. A pillar of white and blue flame geysered into the sky, followed by a thunderous whoomph as the generator's diesel supply ignited. The blinding searchlight flickered once and died, plunging the ridge back into a terrifying, strobe-lit darkness. The only light now came from the burning wreckage of the generator, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like giants battling in the snow. The sudden loss of their primary light source threw the syndicate guards into a momentary panic. They were city men, trained in hallways and paved streets. They didn't know the treacherous footing of a slag heap in the dark. They began firing wildly, the muzzle flashes revealing their positions. "Now!" Artie screamed, reaching over Silas's body to grab the handle of the blasting machine. He didn't know if the wires were still connected. He didn't know if the frost had compromised the blasting caps. He only knew that the earth was the only ally they had left. He threw his entire weight onto the plunger. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the very foundation of the mountain shivered. A series of deep, guttural thuds vibrated through the soles of their boots. Not the sharp crack of a gunshot, but the heavy, tectonic groan of the earth being torn asunder. Silas had planted the charges in the overhang above the main access road. The iron vein didn't just collapse. It vomited thousands of tons of granite, iron ore, and frozen topsoil down onto the advancing syndicate line. The sound was deafening, a roar of grinding stone that swallowed the screams of the men below. A massive cloud of red dust and white snow billowed up, coating everything in a fine, gritty powder. When the echoes finally died away, the road was gone. In its place was a jagged wall of rubble, burying two of the white trucks and an unknown number of men beneath the weight of the ridge they had come to steal. A heavy, suffocating silence followed. The gunfire stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Artie slumped against the winch, his chest heaving, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them into his armpits. He looked over the edge of the barricade. Through the drifting smoke and snow, he saw the remaining syndicate guards retreating into the woods, their professional discipline shattered by the primal power of the landslide. But the victory was hollow. "Boyd," Artie called out, his voice a fragile whisper in the dark. There was no answer. Artie looked up at the headframe. The catwalk where Boyd had been standing was riddled with bullet holes. Hanging over the railing, caught by a snag in his heavy coat, was Boyd's rifle. It swung back and forth in the wind, a lonely metallic pendulum. Below it, a dark trail of blood had begun to freeze against the rusted iron ladder. Artie felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the Minnesota winter. It was the coldness of a man who had won the battle, but lost the world. He looked down at Silas, who was breathing in shallow, wet gasps. Around them, the number 9 stood like a skeleton, its iron ribs picked clean by the violence of the night. "We held it, Artie," Silas whispered, a ghostly smile touching his blood-stained lips. Artie didn't answer. He looked at his hands, shredded by wire, stained with blood, and caked in the red dust of the ore. He had saved the land, but as he looked at the bodies littering the snow, he realized the land didn't care. The iron remained silent, indifferent to the 12 lives that had just been extinguished in its name. The massacre was over, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying than the screams.
The blizzard began to taper off as the first light of November 11th bled over the horizon, but there was no warmth in the sun. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, dark, heavy, and cold. As the gray light touched the number 9 ridge, it revealed a landscape that no longer looked like part of the American Midwest. It looked like a battlefield from a forgotten century, a jagged wasteland of splintered timber, twisted iron, and the unnatural mounds of the landslide. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic metallic tink, tink, tink of cooling engines and the distant, mournful cry of a crow circling the carnage. Artie Gable sat on the edge of a rusted ore cart, his posture slumped, his eyes fixed on nothing. He looked like a man made of stone. The frost had settled into the creases of his face, and his hair was matted with a mixture of snow and the fine red dust of the iron ore. In his lap, the Winchester lay heavy and cold, a useless weight now that the air was empty of targets. He didn't move when he heard the crunch of boots on the frozen gravel. He didn't even blink. Sheriff Elias Miller climbed over the pile of rubble that had once been the access gate. He wasn't wearing his badge. His coat was open to the wind, and his face was a mask of grief that looked decades older than it had 24 hours ago. He stopped 10 feet from Artie, his breath forming a thick gray cloud. He looked at the bodies, some half buried in the snow, others draped over the machinery like discarded rags. He saw the black, jagged hole where the generator had exploded, and the wall of rock that had swallowed the syndicate's advance team. "It's over, Artie," Miller said, his voice sounding hollow and thin in the vast open cold. "The state police are at the base of the hill. They've got the road blocked for 5 miles in every direction. National Guard trucks are moving in from Duluth. There's no more fighting left to do." Artie didn't look up. "Did you find Boyd?" Miller hesitated, his eyes wandering to the base of the headframe. 2 deputies were already there, kneeling beside a shape wrapped in a frozen canvas tarp. "We found him. And Silas. Silas didn't make it through the hour, Artie. His lungs gave out just before the sun broke." Artie finally raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot and vacant, the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss and realized the abyss was his own reflection. 12 men, Elias. 12 men who grew up in the same houses, drank at the same bar, and dug in the same dirt. All of them gone for a few feet of fence line and a vein of rock that's been sitting there for 1,000,000 years. "Henderson is alive," Miller said, his voice hardening. "He's down at the staging area, screaming about indictments in federal prison. He wants your head on a platter, Artie. He wants the world to see what happens to people who stand in the way of progress." Artie let out a dry, rattling breath. He looked down at his hands. The bandages had frozen to his skin. The blood turned to a dark, brittle crust. "Let him have it. There's nothing left here anyway. The land, it doesn't feel like mine anymore. It feels heavy, like it's full of ghosts." The scene was a visceral tableau of industrial tragedy. The white trucks of the syndicate were twisted heaps of metal, their security logos obscured by soot and gore. The snow around the mine entrance was a chaotic mosaic of footprints, spent brass casings, and deep frozen ruts where men had crawled for cover. It was a harvest of lead and hate, and the yield was nothing but sorrow. "They're coming for you now," Miller whispered, stepping closer. "I can't stop them this time. The law is back, Artie, and it's got a long memory." Artie stood up, his joints popping with a sound like breaking ice. He didn't reach for his rifle. He let it slide off his lap and clatter onto the frozen ground. He looked at the ridge, the high, jagged spine of Minnesota that he had spent his life defending. The pines stood tall and indifferent, their branches heavy with the new snow. The earth didn't care about the tables or the Millers or the syndicate. It had tasted the blood, it had felt the fire, and now it was simply waiting for the winter to finish the job of burying the evidence. As the first formation of state police silhouettes appeared at the bottom of the ridge, moving like a line of black ants against the white snow, Artie Gable turned his back on the mine. He walked toward the edge of the slope, looking out over the town of Ely. He could see the smoke rising from the chimneys of the houses where widows were just now beginning to realize they were alone. He could see the rusty shovel tavern, its lights still off. "Tell Martha," Artie started, then stopped. There were no words left that could fix what had been broken. "Tell her the fence is still there, for whatever it's worth." The violence on the ridge had ended, but in the town of Ely, a different kind of horror was beginning to take root. The horror of the empty chair. By midday on November 11th, the Iron Vein was no longer a place of industry. It was a crime scene, cordoned off by miles of yellow tape that fluttered like a warning flag in the freezing wind. But the real tragedy was radiating outward into the quiet, salt-crusted streets and the modest wooden houses where the wood stoves hummed with a heat that could no longer warm the hearts of those inside. In the Gable farmhouse, the silence was a physical entity. It sat in the corners of the kitchen, heavy and suffocating. Martha Gable stood by the window, her hands buried in the pockets of an old cardigan. She didn't cry. In the Iron Range, women learned early that tears didn't melt the ice or pay the taxes. She simply watched the road. The breakfast she had prepared at 5 a.m., 3 fried eggs and a stack of toast, sat cold and gelatinous on Artie's plate. A single fly, awakened by the heat of the stove,
buzzed lazily against the glass, the only sign of life in a room that felt like a tomb. On the table lay the remains of a life lived in the service of the land, a stack of overdue notices from the bank, a tattered Sears catalog, and a small framed photograph of Artie as a young man standing proudly in front of his first tractor. The man in the photo had a smile that reached his eyes. The man who had left the house the night before had eyes that looked like spent coals. The sound of a car approaching caused Martha's breath to hitch. It wasn't the heavy, familiar rumble of Artie's truck. It was the smooth, professional hum of the government vehicle. She watched as a black sedan pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching over the frozen mud. Two men in suits stepped out, their polished shoes looking absurdly out of place in the dirt of the farm. They didn't look at the barn or the ridge. They looked at their clipboards. They were the mutes of the new era, men who didn't kill with rifles, but with signatures and no trespassing signs. Martha didn't wait for them to knock. She opened the door and stood on the porch, the sub-zero air biting at her face. "Mrs. Gable?" the younger of the two asked, his voice devoid of any real empathy. "We're with the state trustee's office. We have a court-ordered seizure notice for the property and all associated assets. Given the events of last night, the Gable estate has been placed into receivership to cover potential civil liabilities." Martha looked past them toward the ridge. She could see the smoke still rising from the mine, a thin black finger pointing toward the heavens. "He's not even buried yet," she said, her voice a flat, dead whisper. "And you're already here for the bones." "We have a job to do, ma'am," the man replied, avoiding her gaze. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. You can take your personal effects, but the livestock, the machinery, and the land now belong to the syndicate." She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply turned back into the house and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking was the sound of a century of history being severed. She walked through the rooms, looking at the scuff marks on the floorboards, the height chart penciled onto the pantry door, and the smell of sawdust that clung to Artie's work clothes. This wasn't just a house. It was a diary written in wood and nails, and now the pages were being ripped out. Across town, at the Miller residence, the scene was even more grim. 3 families had gathered in the small living room, the widows of the Miller cousins sitting together on a worn velvet sofa. They didn't speak. They just held each other's hands, their knuckles white. The local priest stood in the corner, his Bible open, but he couldn't find the words. What do you say to a mother whose husband and brother were blown apart over a dispute about mineral rights? What brayer can fix a town that has just committed suicide? The Rusty Shovel Tavern remained dark. Someone had thrown a rock through the front window, and the wind whistled through the jagged hole, stirring the sawdust on the floor. On the bar, a half-finished glass of beer sat where Silas Miller had left it 2 nights ago, now flat and covered in a thin layer of dust. The jukebox was silent. The laughter was gone. The Iron Range had always been a hard place, but it had been a place of community. Now it was just a collection of individuals trapped in their own grief, separated by a fence line that was now stained with the blood of their sons. As the sun began to dip behind the pines, casting long skeletal shadows across the snow, the town of Ely felt like a ghost of itself. The Iron Vein had finally won. It had taken the men, it had taken the land, and now it was taking the peace. The massacre wasn't just the shots fired on the ridge. It was the slow, agonizing death of a way of life. Martha Gable sat on the edge of her bed, holding Artie's heavy wool coat to her chest. She could still smell the iron ore and the faint scent of gun oil. She closed her eyes and heard the wind howling through the rafters, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to carry the names of the 12 men into the dark. The house was cold. The fire had gone out, and in the hallways of Ely, the only thing left was the echo of a struggle that had ended in a hollow, bitter silence.
The trial did not take place in Ely. The authorities, fearing a populist uprising or a second wave of violence from the surviving miners, moved the proceedings to the sterile gray stone grandeur of the federal courthouse in Duluth. For 3 weeks in January 1977, the air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of floor wax, wet wool, and the suffocating tension of a foregone conclusion. Arthur Gable sat at the defendant's table, his frame appearing diminished within a suit that hung loosely off his shoulders. His hands, still scarred with the jagged white lines from the razor wire, remained folded on the mahogany table, as motionless as the iron ore he had once mined. Behind the bench sat Judge Horatio Vance, a man whose face was a mask of constitutional rigidity. He looked at the world through gold-rimmed spectacles that seemed to filter out any nuance of human suffering, leaving only the black and white text of the law. To his left sat the prosecution, a phalanx of young, sharp-featured men in pinstriped suits, representing the Strategic Mineral Recovery Act and the interests of the Duluth Mining Syndicate. They spoke in the language of logistics, tonnage, and industrial disruption. They never mentioned the name of the dead Hereford, and they never spoke of the generations of Gables buried on the ridge. The defendant, the lead prosecutor proclaimed, pointing a silver pen toward Arthur, did not engage in a protest. He engaged in a calculated act of domestic sabotage. He took the lives of 7 security contractors and caused the deaths of 5 of his own associates by orchestrating a catastrophic structural failure of the number 9 shaft. He placed the sanctity of a fence line above the lives of men and the laws of this state. When Arthur was finally called to the stand, the courtroom fell into a vacuum of silence. The gallery was packed with people from Ely, weathered men in their Sunday best and women with hollow eyes who had traveled 3 hours through a blizzard just to see if the truth still had a voice. Mr. Gable, his own attorney asked, a man provided by the miners' union, who looked like he knew he was losing. Can you tell the court why you didn't wait for the appellate ruling? Why did you take up arms? Arthur looked at the judge, then at the rows of suits, and finally at his neighbors. His voice, when it came, was not a roar, but a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. I didn't take up arms to win a case, he said, his words measured and heavy. I took them up because the law had already left us. You talk about strategic interests and tonnage, but that dirt, it has my father's sweat in it. It has the blood of men who died in cave-ins so your cities could have steel. You didn't come to us with a fair price. You came with wire and silhouettes in the dark. In the North, when a man comes to steal your life's work with a gun, you don't call a lawyer, you call upon your soul. The judge's gavel struck the wood with a sharp final crack. Order! Mr. Gable, your personal philosophies are not a defense for the loss of 12 lives. The verdict was delivered on a Tuesday morning. Guilty on all counts of first-degree manslaughter, aggravated assault, and the illegal use of explosives. The syndicate was cleared of all wrongdoing, their actions deemed unfortunate but justifiable under the protection of private enterprise and state-mandated mineral extraction. As the bailiffs moved in to lead Arthur away, he didn't look at the judge. He looked at Henderson, who was sitting in the front row, his face smooth and victorious. Henderson didn't look back. He was already checking his watch, likely thinking about the drilling rigs that were finally moving onto the Gable property that very afternoon. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole. As Arthur was led through the side door, the people of Ely stood up in unison. They didn't cheer, and they didn't protest. They stood in a grim, silent salute, a wall of denim and grief. The law had spoken, but the justice of the range remained unsatisfied. Outside, the Duluth wind howled off Lake Superior, bitter, freezing gale that seemed to mock the warmth of the courtroom. The iron vein was officially open for business, but the price of the first ton of ore had been the soul of a town. Arthur Gable was headed to a concrete cell in Stillwater, but he left behind a landscape that would never forget the night the iron turned red. The gavel had fallen, and the cold finality of the law had buried the truth deeper than any mineshaft. 10 years have passed since the night the sky over Ely burned with the fire of the number 9. By the winter of 1986, the headlines have turned yellow in the archives, and the names of the Gable and Miller families have faded into the footnotes of industrial history. But on the Iron Range, the land does not forget. Time here is not measured by calendars, but by the slow, relentless creep of rust, and the way the forest gradually reclaims what was stolen from it. The ridge itself is a scarred monument to futility. The syndicate's grand ambitions for the iron vein lasted less than 5 years. As it turned out, the ore was harder to extract than the geologists had promised, and the global price of steel collapsed just as the first deep shafts were completed. The company filed for bankruptcy in '81, leaving behind a landscape of abandoned machinery and hollowed-out hills. The great drilling rigs now sit like skeletal prehistoric beasts, their steel bones weeping orange streaks of oxidation into the snow. The iron vein is no longer a source of wealth. It is a ghost, a jagged wound in the earth that refuses to heal. In the town of Ely, the rusty shovel is gone, replaced by a boarded-up storefront with a for-lease sign that has been there for half a decade. The population has dwindled, the young people fleeing to the Twin Cities or the Dakotas, leaving only the old and the haunted behind. You can see them on the benches outside the post office,
Men with hunched shoulders and hollow eyes who still remember the sound of the siren and the smell of the cordite. They don't talk about the massacre. Some secrets are too heavy to carry into the light. Martha Gable passed away in a nursing home in 1983. They say she died of a broken heart, but the truth is she simply ran out of reasons to breathe in a world that had taken everything she loved. The Gable farm is a ruin now. The roof of the barn has caved in under the weight of 100 blizzards, and the fence line, the very line that triggered the bloodbath, is buried under a thicket of buckthorn and wild raspberry. The iron wire is still there, invisible beneath the thorns, slowly being swallowed by the bark of the trees, becoming a permanent part of the wood. In Stillwater Prison, Arthur Gable sits by a small barred window that looks out over a different kind of gray horizon. He is an old man now, his hair the color of wood smoke, his hands garneled and stiff. He doesn't receive visitors. He spends his pays in the silence of his cell, staring at his palms. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he swears he can hear the rhythmic clack-clack of the ore cars and the distant laughter of the Miller cousins. He doesn't regret the fight, but he carries the weight of the 12 men every time he closes his eyes. He is the last living repository of the truth, a man buried alive by the same law that claimed his land. The Iron Vein Massacre was supposed to be a lesson in progress, a testament to the inevitability of the machine. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about the breaking point of the human spirit. It proved that you can take a man's job, his money, and his future, but if you try to take his soil, you are inviting a ghost into your house. As the sun sets on another Minnesota winter, the wind howls through the rusted headframe of the number 9. It makes a high whistling sound, like a flute played by a madman. Some say it's just the wind. Others, the few who still remember, say it's the voices of the 12, still standing guard over the ridge. The snow falls softly, covering the slag heaps and the rotted timbers, turning the battlefield back into a pristine white wilderness. The iron remains deep in the earth, cold and indifferent, waiting for the next generation of men to come and die for it. But for now, there is only the silence, the heavy, fatal silence of the North, where the memories are long and the blood never truly washes away.